The snow had been falling since before dawn, and by 8:15 in the morning, it had buried the sidewalks of Michigan Avenue under 4 inches of white silence. Chicago did this sometimes, threw itself at you without warning, without mercy, without apology. Ethan Cole had lived in this city for 11 years, and still hadn't entirely made peace with its winters. He stood at the base of the Northbridge Global Tower and looked up. 48 floors of glass and steel, the kind of building designed to make you feel small before you ever stepped inside. His reflection stared back at him from the lobby doors. A man in a charcoal suit that had been pressed 3 times to hide where the fabric had thinned at the elbows. A tie his daughter had helped him knot that morning, because she said the color made his eyes look important, and hands so red from the cold, they barely looked like hands at all. He pushed through the revolving door. The lobby was warm and quiet and smelled faintly of money. That particular blend of leather, fresh flowers, and climate-controlled air that existed nowhere except the ground floors of buildings where decisions were made that affected thousands of lives. Ethan signed in at the security desk, clipped his visitor badge to his lapel, and rode the elevator to the 14th floor, where HR occupied a long corridor of glass-walled offices and conference rooms. He had prepared for this. He had spent 4 nights rereading the company's annual reports, studying their operations division, rehearsing answers to questions he anticipated a senior interviewer might ask. He had left Lily at school 40 minutes early so he wouldn't be rushed. He had everything he could control under control. The man who entered conference room B was named Dennis Hartwell. He was perhaps 50, with the build of someone who had once played college lacrosse and now channeled that same combativeness into quarterly reviews. He carried a manila folder. He did not shake Ethan's hand. "Cole," he said, settling into the chair across the table. "Ethan Cole." He opened the folder and stared at the resume. Inside, the way a doctor stares at an X-ray, looking for the fracture before he's even said, "Hello." Operations background, project management, logistics, strong numbers in your mid-career. He paused. Then nothing. 3 years. My wife was diagnosed with leukemia in January of 2021. Ethan said he had decided he wouldn't dress it up. She passed away 18 months later. My daughter was 4. I made the decision to be home with her through the worst of it. Hartwell nodded slowly in the way people nod when they are not actually processing what you've said. He turned a page. The gap is the issue. He tapped the paper. 3 years is a long time in operations. Systems change, protocols change. We'd essentially be bringing in someone who needs to be retrained from the ground up at the senior level. That's a liability, Mr. Cole. Frankly, that's a significant liability. I've spent the last 6 months doing exactly that, Ethan said. Certifications in current supply chain management software, updated project management credentials, consulting work for 2 mid-size logistics firms. He started to open his portfolio. I have the documentation and the single-parent situation. Hartwell kept moving. School pickups, sick days, emergencies. We run a lean team. Our senior directors don't have the bandwidth to absorb someone who's, let's say, divided. The room was very quiet. Ethan looked at Dennis Hartwell. He looked at him. The way you look at something you are choosing not to become. You've been referring to my daughter as a liability for the last 3 minutes, Ethan said. I want to make sure I understand the conversation we're actually having. Hartwell set down the folder. He did not look embarrassed. That was perhaps the worst part. I'm saying the position requires full commitment. And your circumstances suggest my circumstances, Ethan said quietly, are that I raised a child through the death of her mother without taking a single cent from anyone. And I am here in your office on time, prepared, and qualified. He picked up his portfolio. He left the resume on the table. He did not pick it up. I won't take more of your morning. He walked out, not fast. Not in a way that looked like retreat. Just out through the glass door, down the corridor, past the receptionist who pretended to be absorbed in her screen, into the elevator. The doors closed. The lobby, the revolving door, the cold. The snow was coming down harder now. He stood on the sidewalk and let it fall on his shoulders. And he thought about Lily waiting at Jefferson Elementary, the last child in her classroom again. And he thought, okay. There will be another interview. There will always be another interview. He started walking south. He didn't know that on the 48th floor, a woman was watching him go. Victoria Sterling had been conducting the HR audit for 40 minutes before anyone realized she was listening to the wrong room. The system was standard a compliance review, the kind the legal department requested every 18 months to ensure hiring protocols were being followed correctly across all departments. Victoria did these personally, not because she distrusted her compliance team, but because she had learned long ago that the gap between what a company claimed it did and what it actually did was most visible in the small moments. How a rejection was worded, how a pause landed, what a manager said when he believed no one of consequence was listening. She had been referencing a spreadsheet of interview panel compositions when a mislabeled audio feed opened in the corner of her screen conference room. B instead of the D wing focus group she'd intended. She was about to close it when she heard 3 years is a long time in operations. Victoria Sterling had a habit cultivated over 2 decades of finishing what she started. She listened to the entire interview. She did not move her chair. She did not make a sound. Her expression did not change in any way that anyone observing her would have identified as emotion. But her right hand, resting beside her keyboard, had stopped moving. Her fingers were perfectly still. When the feed went silent, when she heard the door to conference room B open and close, and the distant sound of elevator chime, she reached forward and pulled up the candidate file. She zoomed the previous address at the top of the resume. 17 Winter Hollow Road, Chicago. Victoria had not seen that address in almost 7 years. But she knew it immediately, the way you know the handwriting of someone you once loved, without having to think about it at all. 17. Winter Hollow Road had been deeded to a family trust in 2003. The trust was sealed, its beneficiaries confidential, its management invisible to the company's general records. Victoria's mother, Margaret Sterling, had established it 4 months before her death. Victoria had read the trust documents exactly once, the night her estate attorney handed them to her, and she had set them aside because everything about that period was something she had needed to set aside in order to keep functioning. She had never located the trust's secondary beneficiary. Until now, her hands were not entirely steady when she picked up her phone. She called her head of security, the man who just left HR on 14. She said, "Cole, don't let him leave the building." The security team reached the lobby in 4 minutes. Ethan was already gone. Victoria received this information in the elevator on her way down, and for a moment, she stood very still in the descending car and thought about what she was doing. Then the doors opened and she walked out into the lobby and through the revolving door into the white cold of Michigan Avenue. She was wearing 4-in heels. The snow on the sidewalk was deep enough that her first step sank her right shoe to the ankle. She did not stop. She could see him half a block south, walking with his head down against the wind, the shoulders of his dark suit already white with accumulation. She did not call after him. Shouting across Michigan Avenue in the middle of a snowstorm was not something Victoria Sterling did. Instead, she pulled out her phone and typed a message to her driver. Lakeshore position. Now then, she walked after him herself. Her phone buzzed. She glanced at it without stopping. A notification from Jefferson Elementary's parent alert system forwarded from the candidate file. The emergency contact. The message read, "Hello. This is a reminder that aftercare ends at 5:00 p.m. Lily Cole is currently the only child remaining in after-air pickup." She looked up. He was at the corner now, standing in the snow, staring at his phone with the particular stillness of someone receiving news that changes the calculations of the next few hours. She caught up to him as the light changed. "Mr. Cole." He turned. For a moment, he didn't seem to register who she was. She was, after all, standing on a public sidewalk in what had become a blizzard. Mascara intact, posture exact, with her left heel submerged in a snow drift. Then, recognition moved across his face. "Miss Sterling," he said it noodly, not hostile, just measuring. "I need to speak with you." And she looked at his phone, which he was still holding. "You need to get your daughter. My car is at the corner. Let me drive you. I appreciate the offer." "It is not entirely an offer," she said. "There are things I need to tell you. They're important, and Jefferson Elementary is 12 minutes from here by car, which in this weather is probably 40 minutes on foot." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without blinking, which was something she had practiced for years and which most people found uncomfortable. He didn't seem to find it uncomfortable. He seemed to be genuinely thinking. "All right," he said. The Maybach was idling at the corner, exhaust curling in the cold air. The driver opened the rear door. Ethan Cole paused on the sidewalk and then got in, and Victoria Sterling got in after him. And the door closed, and the city disappeared behind tinted glass. The interior of the car was warm and very quiet. The snow hit the windows without making a sound. Victoria turned toward him. She had a way of organizing herself before speaking, a brief internal settling, like a musician finding the key before the first note. Ethan watched it happen and said nothing. "Your wife," she said her maiden name. He didn't answer immediately. "Why?" "Because it matters. And because I think you may already know it matters, which is why you're hesitating." Ethan looked at the window. Outside, Chicago moved past them in slow motion. The white streets, the dark storefronts. A woman struggling to fold a broken umbrella on a corner. "Her name was Claire," he said. "Claire Holloway. When I met her," he paused. "Before that, her legal name was Claire Sterling." The silence in the car changed quality. "My mother had a daughter," Victoria said slowly. "Born before her marriage to my father. The girl was placed in a private adoption through a sealed arrangement. My mother told me about her when she was dying. She told me she had set aside a provision for her, a trust. She didn't know how to find her." She stopped. "I didn't know how to find her either. I tried for 2 years. Claire didn't know." Ethan said she knew she was adopted. She didn't know by whom. "No. The records were sealed." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He set a small object on the seat between them, a silver locket, oval-shaped, worn smooth at the edges. Victoria looked at it. She recognized the engraving on the back without picking it up. A small stylized M inside a wreath of leaves. Her mother's initial, her mother's jewelry maker. She had seen that mark on a dozen pieces in her childhood. "Claire wore it every day," Ethan said. "She said her birth father sent it with her when she was adopted. She said it was the only thing she had." Victoria did not touch the locket. She looked at it for a long moment. "Lily," she said. "How old is she?" 6. "She'll be 7 in March." Victoria turned to the window. The school would be coming up in the next few minutes. She could see it on the navigation screen, embedded in the front console. She gave herself those few minutes to absorb what had happened. That her mother's trust, the provision she had spent 2 years trying to locate, had been sitting in a resume on a desk in conference room. B. That the child currently waiting in an after-air room at Jefferson Elementary was her niece. "The trust," she said. "My mother set aside a substantial provision for Claire's child. It's held in a structured account tied to Northbridge Global's founding shares. The provision specifies that if Claire's direct heir can be identified and verified, they receive." She stopped herself. This was not the place for numbers. A significant ownership stake in the company. "I'm not interested in the company's money," Ethan said. "Lily is 6 years old. I'm not walking her into a boardroom." "I know." She said it without defensiveness. "I'm not asking you to. I'm telling you what exists because it's her right to know it exists." She looked at him directly, and because someone else in that boardroom already knows and has for some time and has spent considerable energy ensuring no one ever found you. They had Lily in the back seat by 3:45. She was 6 years old, dark-haired, and wearing a backpack shaped like a ladybug that was almost as large as she was. She had climbed in without much ceremony. informed Ethan that her friend Marcus had brought a frog to school in his jacket pocket. And the teacher had cried, and then gone quiet when she noticed the woman sitting on the other side of the seat. "This is Miss Sterling," Ethan said. "She gave us a ride." Lily studied Victoria with the direct, unhurried assessment only small children apply to strangers. "Your shoes are wet," she observed. "They are," Victoria said. "You should have worn boots." "You're right, I should have." Lily appeared to find this acceptable. She turned back to the window and fogged it with her breath, and drew a small sun in the condensation, which struck Victoria as an odd thing to draw in the middle of a February blizzard. And then she didn't think about it further because everything happened very fast. The black SUV had been behind them for 6 blocks. Ethan saw at first a flash of awareness in his peripheral vision. The particular tension of someone who had driven enough in winter to know that the gap between the vehicles was wrong. Too short, too steady, the way a vehicle moves when it is following rather than traveling. He said, "Victoria." She had already seen it. The impact came from the left, not the SUV behind them, but a second vehicle that had been parked on the shoulder of Lakeshore Drive. A gray sedan that pulled out directly into their lane at the intersection before the bridge. The Maybach driver reacted brakes over correction. The car sliding on the iced surface in a long, sickening arc. They came to rest with the rear of the car against the guardrail, facing partially across both lanes. Lily had not made a sound. Ethan had his arm across her before the car stopped moving. 3 men got out of the SUV. They moved with the economy of people who had done this before. "Ethan," Victoria's voice was level. "The door on your left. Push it hard. The frame is warped." He pushed it hard. The door gave. He took Lily. She wrapped her legs around his waist without being told and buried her face in his shoulder. And he felt her hands grip the back of his collar. Not crying, just holding, which was somehow worse and better at the same time. Victoria was already outside. She had left her heels in the car. She was running in stocking feet across the snow-covered bridge in a winter coat. Moving toward the far rail where a maintenance gate was set into the structure. She reached it, examined the lock for 2 seconds, and pulled a pin from her hair. "I went through a phase in college," she said when she saw Ethan's expression. The lock gave. The gate swung inward. Beyond it was a narrow, maintenance walkway that ran beneath the roadway of the bridge, dark, low ceiling, smelling of rust and river cold. Victoria went first. Ethan went in after her with Lily, pulling the gate closed behind them. They were in darkness. Outside, they could hear the sound of car doors. Footsteps on the bridge surface overhead. Ethan pressed his back against the wall and looked at Victoria in the dim light filtered through the grate above them. She was standing very still, eyes closed, controlled breathing. Her stocking feet were on concrete that was crusted with ice. Lily had turned her head against his shoulder. In a very small voice, she said, "Dad, is there a bad guy?" "There might be," Ethan said. "But we're doing what we do when things are hard. We stay calm and we pay attention," Lily said. "That's right." Victoria opened her eyes. She looked at the 2 of them, the man and the small girl, reciting their private ritual in a frozen underpass, and something moved across her face that she didn't try to control. "There's a service ladder at the east end," she said. "It exits in the parking structure below Millennium Station. My security team is already on alert. If we can get there, then we go," Ethan said. "Lyd," she went first again. He noticed she didn't once look back to check if he was keeping up. She assumed he was. He found oddly that he liked that the apartment on South Wabash was the kind of place that existed in the negative space of expensive cities. A basement unit that occupied the bones of what had once been a storage area with 2 windows that looked out at ground level and allowed in approximately 90 minutes of direct sunlight per day in the best months of the year. The radiator worked intermittently. The kitchen was narrow enough that 2 adults couldn't stand in it at the same time without one of them rotating sideways. It was also warm enough once Ethan got the oven going with the door propped open a few inches. A trick he'd learned in the third winter when the radiator had given out for 5 straight days and he'd called the landlord 6 times. Victoria sat at the kitchen table and watched him move through the space with the fluency of someone who knew where every object in it lived. He knew where the blankets were, where the first aid kit was, where the backup phone charger was coiled on the shelf above the refrigerator. He also knew, without having to look, where Lily's drawing supplies were. And he set them in front of her on the table before. She asked. "Who was that?" He said. He was at the stove now, heating water. He said it without turning around, which Victoria understood was deliberate. He was giving her space to answer without being watched. "My cousin," she said. "Nathan Sterling. He's been the de facto head of Northbridge's executive committee since my father stepped back 5 years ago. He knows the trust's terms. If Lily is verified as Claire's daughter, as my mother's grandchild, she inherits a controlling interest in the founding shares. That interest currently sits in Nathan's voting block." She paused. "He loses half the board." Ethan turned around. He was holding 2 mugs. He set one in front of her. He sat across the table. "He knew we found the locket. He knew I accessed the candidate file. My system flagged it. He's had a monitor on the trust records for years." She wrapped her hands around the mug. "He's been careful. He's also been assuming that Claire's hair either didn't know about the trust or couldn't prove their claim. And now we can. And now we can." She looked at Lily, who was drawing in careful silence. Apparently a horse being chased by a very large bird. "The annual shareholder assembly is tomorrow morning, 900. If I appear at that meeting with documentation, he loses his ability to push through the restructuring vote he's been building toward for 2 years. "What kind of restructuring?" "The kind that dissolves the trust permanently. That eliminates the founding share provisions entirely." She met his eyes. "He needs the vote to happen before anyone verifies Lily's claim. If I don't walk into that boardroom tomorrow morning, he calls the assembly in absentia, and it passes." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You've been running the company alone for how long?" "Since I was 31, and you handle things like this by yourself." It was not a question. She knew that. "Typically," she said, "you're not going to handle this one by yourself." The radiator knocked twice and then went quiet. Outside, the snow had not stopped falling. Ethan knew a man named Marco Delgado, who drove for the city's Municipal Winter Operations Division, the fleet of trucks responsible for clearing Chicago's arterial roads through the overnight hours. They had met 5 years earlier when Ethan had helped Marco navigate an insurance dispute after a pileup on the Dan Ryan. They had stayed in sporadic contact the way people do when they've done something real for each other. He called Marco at 9:15 in the evening. "I need to ask you something unusual," Ethan said. "You think I haven't noticed that unusual is your natural state?" Marco said, "What do you need?" Ethan told him. There was a pause. "You want to put a billionaire in the back of a salt truck. I want to get a billionaire across the loop without anyone seeing her. The snowplow convoys have a security corridor. Nothing stops them. Nothing follows them. They have loading dock access to the commercial district. She needs to be at the Northbridge Tower by 6:00 a.m. Another pause. "She's actually going to get in the truck." Ethan looked at Victoria, who was at the kitchen table, reviewing documents on a phone whose battery they had kept alive with the backup charger. She had in the past 2 hours drafted 3 corporate filings, located the trust's verification codes from memory and consumed approximately 4 cups of tea. She was also, despite everything, sitting perfectly straight. "She's going to get in the truck," he said. "Mara is going to think I've lost my mind." Marco said. "Okay, 5:00 a.m. South loading dock on Wabash. I'll have papers for you. Maintenance contractor passes. Don't wear anything that looks expensive." Victoria was already pulling off her watch. They left Lily with Mrs. Patricia Owens on the second floor. a retired school librarian who had been Lily's unofficial grandmother for 3 years and whose apartment always smelled of cardamom and beeswax. Lily went without protest, which meant she trusted Mrs. Owens completely, which Ethan knew was the highest possible endorsement a 6-year-old could give. They were outside at 4:45 in the morning. The street was empty and white, and the plows were already audible in the distance. That deep mechanical groan of machinery moving through a sleeping city. Victoria was wearing Ethan's old field jacket over her corporate clothes. She had borrowed a pair of wool socks from his drawer. She had not asked permission to borrow them. She had simply found them and put them on. The truck was enormous. Up close, a 12-wheel municipal plow with a brine tank and a blade the width of a lane and a half. Marco waved them around to the equipment cab in the rear. A narrow enclosed space, typically used for spare hydraulic parts and emergency road gear. It smelled of diesel and road salt. "Next time," Victoria said, climbing in, "I am taking the helicopter." "You have a helicopter?" Ethan asked. "I have 2 helicopters," she said. "This is not how I expected to spend a February." Marco sealed the compartment. The truck's engine engaged. They moved. The Northbridge Global Tower's loading dock was a concrete canyon at street level, accessible from an alley off Madison Street. The plow convoy rolled through without challenge. Municipal vehicles moved through secured corridors on authority alone, and no one in the building's night security team had been briefed to look for a CEO returning via brine truck. They came in through the service entrance at 6:02. Marco had the contractor passes, and the dock supervisor, who owed Marco a favor involving a parking ticket dispute from 2019, waved them through without a second look. The service elevator ran on its own key system. Victoria had the code memorized. She had designed the building's security architecture herself when they relocated to this tower, and she had kept the service access protocols in her own control for exactly the kind of situation she had never actually expected to be in. They rode up to 48 in silence. The doors opened to the executive corridor, carpeted dim at this hour, lit by the automatic perimeter lighting that activated when motion was detected. The whole floor had the particular quiet of a space that expected no one at this hour. Down the corridor past the glass wall of Victoria's personal office, the boardroom doors stood closed. Beyond them, voices. "He started early. Ethan said he needs the vote done before I can appear and contest it." Victoria looked at her phone. The assembly was called for 9. "He's moved it up, trying to execute before the business day properly begins." Can he do that? Under the emergency provisions he invoked? Technically, yes. Which is why she started walking. "We need to be in that room in the next 4 minutes." They moved down the corridor. Through the glass wall of the boardroom, Ethan could see a long table ringed with people, 15, maybe 18. A mix of board members and executive committee representatives, some of them apparently joining remotely through a large display screen on the far wall. Nathan Sterling stood at the head of the table. He was perhaps 55, silver-haired, with a kind of face that had learned to express authority by removing everything else from it. He was in the middle of a sentence. The doors opened. Nathan Sterling stopped mid-sentence. For a moment, the room was absolutely still. Victoria walked in. Her hair was windblown. She was wearing an oversized field jacket over a corporate dress and borrowed wool socks with her ruined shoes. She carried a leather document wallet in one hand and her phone in the other. She walked to the opposite end of the table from Nathan and set both items down and pulled out the chair and sat in it, as though she had been there all morning. "Continuing," she said, "Victoria." Nathan's voice had lost none of its composure. He was very good. "You've been missing for I've been navigating a city in a blizzard while your associates tried to remove me from it," she said. "We'll discuss that afterward. Right now, I'd like to introduce someone." She looked at the doorway. Ethan stepped in. Behind him, unexpected, was Mrs. Patricia Owens, who had apparently decided at some point in the early morning that a retired school librarian with a good hat and a firm handshake was the right person to accompany a 6-year old into a corporate board meeting. Lily was holding her hand. She was still wearing the ladybug backpack. The room reacted. People shifted. Someone on the video screen leaned forward. "This is Lily Cole," Victoria said. "She is the daughter of Claire Sterling Cole, who was the daughter of Margaret Sterling, who founded this company in 1987. She opened the document wallet. "I have a certified copy of a birth certificate. DNA documentation completed 18 months ago when Claire Cole was still alive and which was preserved in a sealed legal record, and the original trust instrument establishing Claire Sterling Cole's daughter as the secondary beneficiary of my mother's founding shares." She set the papers on the table. "I also have this." She set the silver locket on the table. The boardroom was very quiet. Nathan Sterling looked at the locket. Whatever he had been expecting this morning, whatever contingencies he had built into this plan over the years, it had not included a small girl with a ladybug backpack standing at the end of his boardroom in the middle of a February snowstorm. He recovered. He was good enough to recover. The verification process for a claim of this nature requires the process is documented in the trust instrument on page 7, Victoria said. The DNA is already verified. The birth certificate is certified. The locket is the identifying object specified in the trust's authentication clause. She looked at him directly. "This is not a claim in process, Nathan. This is a completed claim being presented at the appropriate governance venue, which is here, which is now." She opened her phone. She pulled up the voting ledger. "I'd like to proceed to the agenda item regarding the founding share provisions, and I'd like the record to reflect that those provisions are now activated, not dissolved." Nathan Sterling was not a man who collapsed easily. He had spent 30 years in boardrooms building a version of himself and did not break under pressure. And even now, with the room tilted against him, he made one more move. "The documentation requires independent verification," he said. "The board cannot act on materials presented without prior legal review." "The board can absolutely act," said a woman at the far end of the table. Her name was Dr. Renata Marsh, and she had been on Northbridge's board for 11 years, and had watched Nathan Sterling absorb authority like a slow tide coming in, and she had been waiting with some patience for a moment exactly like this one. "The trust instrument is self-authenticating under its own terms, which we can all read on page 7 as Miss Sterling noted. I move that we accept the documentation." "Second," said two people simultaneously. Nathan looked at the room. He was reading it the way a navigator reads a horizon measuring how far the weather had already moved. It had moved very far. He looked at the locket. He looked at Lily, who was standing beside Mrs. Owens, with complete patience, studying the view from the 48th floor window with the uncomplicated interest of someone for whom tall buildings were genuinely impressive, regardless of context. He looked at Ethan Cole, who was standing near the door with his arms loose at his sides and no particular expression on his face. Nathan Sterling sat down. There was paperwork after that. A great deal of it, as there always is when a tectonic plate shifts inside a corporation. The vote on the trust provisions passed. The proposed dissolution measure was tabled. 3 board members who had previously supported Nathan's restructuring plan updated their positions within the hour. At 10:15, 2 men from the company's corporate security division appeared at Nathan Sterling's chair and asked him to accompany them. He went without a scene, which Ethan had not entirely expected, but which on reflection made sense. Nathan Sterling had always preferred the appearance of control, even when surrendering it. The Chicago Police Department arrived at 10:40. By noon, the snow had begun, very slightly, to ease. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in early March, when the temperature had climbed enough to make the sidewalks wet instead of white, Ethan Cole sat across from a job candidate in a conference room on the 14th floor of Northbridge Global. The room was the same one he'd been interviewed in. He had specifically requested it. The candidate's name was James Whitfield. He was 38. His resume was solid in the middle and thin at the edges. 3 and 1/2 years of absence near the end of it. "Tell me about the gap," Ethan said. He said it the way his daughter said things. She actually wanted to know no directly. Without loading the question with anything extra, James Whitfield looked at him for a moment, clearly adjusting to the register of the question. My father had a stroke, he said. I moved back to be his primary caregiver. He recovered about 60%, he's stable now. He paused. I kept some consulting work on the side. I wasn't entirely out of the field. Tell me what you did during that time, Ethan said. Not the consulting, the caregiving. What did you learn? Another adjustment. James Whitfield thought about it seriously, which Ethan took as a good sign. I learned how to work without sleep and still make good decisions, Whitfield said. I learned that most crises are not actually emergencies. They just feel like emergencies because you're in them. I learned how to prioritize better than any project management course ever taught me. I learned that I'm more patient than I thought I was. He stopped. I don't know if any of that is what you're looking for. It's exactly what I'm looking for, Ethan said. He made a note. The interview continued down the hall in the corner office that had been reassigned 3 times since the building's construction and was now Victoria, Sterling's primary Chicago workspace. Lily Cole was sitting at a small table that had appeared in the corner of the room 2 days ago. A child's table, oak-colored, with 2 small chairs and a set of good drawing pencils in a tin. She was working on something she had described to Ethan as a map, but for feelings, not places, which he hadn't entirely understood, but which appeared to involve a significant number of colors. Victoria was on a call. She was using her headset, which allowed her to walk as she talked, which she preferred, and which meant she occasionally circled the small table on her way past and glanced at the map without breaking her conversation. Once, without stopping, she handed Lily a cup of warm apple juice that she'd had someone bring up from the cafeteria because she'd noticed the previous day that Lily preferred it to anything else on offer. Lily said, "Thank you," without looking up from the map. Victoria kept walking, kept talking, but the rhythm of her movement changed slightly, a loosening almost imperceptible in the set of her shoulders. At 12:30, Ethan knocked on the office door. Lily looked up. "Lunch," he said. "5 more minutes," she said. "I'm almost done with the green part." 3 minutes. 4. Victoria ended her call. She looked at the two of them, the child negotiating timelines with her father with perfect seriousness, the man crouching in the doorway at eye level with her to make the discussion fair. Outside the window, the city was a watercolor of gray and brown and melting white. And here and there in the corners of the view, something that might have been the beginning of a change. "I'll get my coat," Victoria said. Lily looked at her with surprise. "You're coming to lunch if you'll have me." The 6-year-old considered this with appropriate gravity. Then she nodded once decisively and began putting the cap back on the green pencil. "You can see the map when I'm done," she told Victoria. "You might be in it." Victoria Sterling, who had spent 20 years building something out of nothing, who had learned to absorb every room she entered and turn its weight to her advantage, who had run a billion-dollar company before she was 40, and had never once let anyone see the full inventory of what it had cost her, felt something move in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. She was beginning to think that was all right. Outside, March was doing what March does. Not yet spring, not quite winter. Something unsettled, and in between, and full of the low hum of what might come next. They went to lunch. The city was wet and ordinary and completely itself.